Welcome to this latest episode of Silicon Bites. Today we're going to talk about two sticks and no carrot. The deal, the terrible, terrible minerals deal that's being put to Ukraine, the rumored clauses that it contains, and why it may be designed to be unacceptable to Ukraine's leadership. The story in today's episode has come as a huge and bewildering shock to a lot of people, but unfortunately, it is something that Jonathan Pearce and myself suggested was a possibility some weeks back, and that is the full alignment of Washington with Moscow's objectives, which amount to a modern day Molotov-Ribbentrop pact, an attempt to carve up Ukrainian territory, assets, and resources, including minerals, metals, hydrocarbons, and now infrastructure as well, in a neo-colonial annexation. The worst aspect is that this is being likely coordinated with a reincarnated evil empire, the Russian imperial project, the resurrection of the USSR, and a terror state that has committed innumerable war crimes, some of which amount to modern day genocide comparable to the Holodomor. Although a kind of theatrical game has been taking place whereby Zelensky and the Ukrainian team appear to be on board with the Americans' so-called ceasefire negotiation process and have not been publicly critical of it, despite the weighting of that process and the proposals emerging from it being entirely towards Moscow's interests, despite the wholesale and flagrant violations of the ceasefire agreement by Putin. Well, what Trump is offering is two sticks and no carrot. That is, there are no security guarantees offered and no new military aid in the so-called deal. But the US is demanding huge control over resources and revenue from Ukraine's economy and future extraction and metallurgical industries, transportation, and agriculture. At the same time, Moscow has revived its nuclear threats and blackmail. And figures in the US, from politicians to media pundits, analysts to social media talking heads, are once more opining about World War III and Armageddon because Ukraine wants to defend itself and not capitulate to Russia. But now, the real positions are becoming clearer. And Zelensky is starting to make a public break with the US. Expect to see more of that in the coming days. Behind the scenes, it is likely that the alignment with Europe and the UK has already been taking shape. And the public tolerance of America's bombast, lunacy, and delusion is just a kind of bluff to keep the focus away from the real shift and change. Zelensky is now openly starting to reject the US proposals and reject the US as an arbiter in the entire process. Zelensky says that Ukraine does not recognize US military aid as loans, and quite right too, because they were not loans when they were given by the Biden administration. One of the key points of the new and highly extortionate so-called minerals deal. Zelensky's team revealed that Kiev received a draft of the new agreement from the US regarding critical minerals, which is completely different from the previous framework document. Where we'll break it down a bit more in this episode, it is an infamous document that ranks alongside the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact as a duplicitous and vile turning point in history. According to Zelensky, Ukraine will not consider the provided military aid as a loan, and indeed the provision of that aid by Biden was not written as a loan when it was given. We are grateful for the support, he said, and this is not a credit, and we will not allow it, he added. Zelensky is right to stand up for the truth and the sovereign rights of his people. We have now reached the point where other world leaders will have to say no to Trump as well if they don't want their sovereign rights to be trampled upon and their resources extorted from them. At the same time, Washington's grand strategy, if indeed it can be called this, is becoming a lot clearer. Trump apparently plans to force Ukraine to restore Putin's gas empire, including the infamous Nord Stream pipelines. Remember the GOP anger at Biden and Germany for not putting a stop to Nord Stream 2? Well, now they want to rebuild the entire corrupt edifice. This concept also threatens European independence and sovereignty and would help Russia to rebuild its economic and military strength. Read between the lines, and the following becomes much clearer. One, Trump does not care for Ukraine or its people, but is likely to have made a cynical deal to carve up the country and its resources, probably with Russia. The deal likely extends to the Arctic, which Russia and the US intend to carve up between them. But to realize the benefit and maintain a balance of power in the region with Russia, the US must take control of Greenland and possibly Canada as well as the navigation routes around and through the Arctic area. The US will cede Europe to Russia as a zone of interference, allowing it to meddle with impunity. In geopolitical terms, a recognized sphere of influence, a territory that can be coerced, controlled, invaded, and plundered. What does the US get in return? Well, it thinks it's getting the bandwidth to focus on countering or competing with China in the Asian arena and pushing back its perceived sphere of influence. Now, we've talked about why that is quite a delusional strategy, trying to force a break between China and Russia, I think, is very unlikely to succeed. If there's truth behind these assumptions, and certainly there are a lot of signs, hints, and circumstantial indicators this may be so, then the US has ditched the idea of sovereignty for small and weak countries. It has ditched the rule of law, the international order based on universal trade and free navigation, and moved to a hegemonic, imperialist era of extraction, extortion, blackmail, and great power politics. Under this plan and whatever secretive arrangements have been made, then NATO is not just redundant, but it becomes an actual barrier to this new mode of business and relations between the large hegemonic blocs of China, the US, and Russia's Eurasian sphere. Similarly, the EU becomes a fly in the ointment, a barrier, and an irritant. Well, if these theories are correct, then the attacks on the EU are going to become just more intense and much greater in scale over the coming days, weeks, and months. Well, let's turn to the apparent new draft of the minerals deal, because it's not really a deal at all. This is not business in the normal sense and cannot be explained by the concept that Trump is simply being transactional. America is also holding a gun to Zelensky's head with unprecedented reparation demands. This is what the deal amounts to, not a negotiation between peers, but the precursor to annexation, appropriation, and extortion. The US must realize that Ukraine will decline it unless they are now receiving their entire worldview from the Kremlin and its duplicitous fictions. In fact, this draft bears all the hallmarks of having been drafted in the Kremlin itself. If the leaked details of the deal are genuine, then Trump is demanding huge repatriation style payments from Ukraine and is laying claim to half of the oil, gas, and hydrocarbon resources, as well as almost all its minerals and much of its industrial and transport infrastructure. And unlike previous iterations of the deal, there are no security guarantees. None, not even a hint of them. And the latest version of the minerals deal, which was attained by The Telegraph, a UK newspaper, is, quote, unprecedented in the history of modern diplomacy and state relations. It is an appropriation document, says Alan Riley, an expert on energy law at the Atlantic Council. There are no guarantees, no defense clauses. The US puts up nothing. The Americans can walk away. The Ukrainians can't. I've never seen anything like it before. The text suggests Trump's chief objective is to incorporate Ukraine as a province of America's energy and resource industries, a sort of hostile business deal made with threats and menaces that in political terms amounts to the annexation of Ukraine's economy and territory. The fear is that the agreement being foisted on Ukraine is parallel to the talks between the US and Russia for a comprehensive energy partnership. They are thinking the unthinkable, namely a plan to restore Western Siberian gas flows to Europe in large volumes, including a version of Nord Stream being re-established. Of course, with the involvement of US companies and Trump aligned financiers, no doubt gaining a major stake in the business. A revived gas trade would flow through Ukraine's gas network, apparently, and later via the Baltic, with work being done to bring the sabotaged Nord Stream pipelines back on stream. But this makes little sense at all, because in so doing, it would undercut the rather profitable and healthy new trade of LNG to Europe from the US. The new draft of the so-called minerals deal states that the US-Ukraine Reconstruction Investment Fund will control Ukraine's critical minerals or other minerals, oil, natural gas, including liquefied natural gas, fuels or other hydrocarbons, and other extractable materials. All bases are covered, including the rare earths, with 50 other minerals such as lithium, titanium, cobalt, aluminium, and zinc listed. Likely that comprehensive list of critical materials was pulled from the US Energy Act. The US would also control infrastructure linked to natural resources, including, but not limited to, roads, rail, pipelines, and other transportation assets, ports, terminals, and other logistics facilities, and refineries, processing facilities, natural gas liquefaction and or regasification facilities, and similar assets. Three of the five board members on the new fund will be chosen by the US. It will have A shares and golden shares. America will receive all the royalties until Ukraine has paid off at least 100 billion of war debt to the US. Remember, it's not really classed as debt and it's not a loan, with 4% interest added, less than $350 billion floated earlier by Mr. Trump, but still half of Ukraine's GDP and completely unpayable. Ukraine has only B shares and will receive 50% of the royalties only once its arrears are paid off. In the meantime, Ukraine is expected to invest vast sums of money to get these industries off the ground without seeing a profit, potentially for year after year after year. This deal is far more rapacious, far harsher, and more punitive than the deal imposed upon Germany after World War I. Remember, those were reparations imposed upon a defeated power and the main aggressor and instigator of the First World War. Ukraine is a blameless victim of aggression. The fund listed in the document is registered in Delaware but under New York jurisdiction. The US has the first right of refusal on all projects. It has authority to examine the books and accounts of any Ukrainian ministry or agency, whatever it wants during office or working hours. Additionally, the US can veto sales of Ukraine's resources to other countries, which might mean banning rare earth sales to China, but it might also restrict sales to Europe. Remember as well that overall Europe has provided more financial aid to Ukraine to shore up its budget, to keep its essential services going, and its government over the 3 years of full-scale war, and cumulatively has provided more military assistance than the US as well. And yet Europe is not mentioned in this deal at all. Professor Riley says it is not compatible with EU membership, and perhaps that is part of the purpose. I must wonder whether the real intention might not be to force Zelensky to reject it. No security guarantees mentioned in this version of the deal, and the US would not put in investment capital to kickstart the extraction industries and regional infrastructure that will be required. In fact, there seems to be little of benefit to Ukraine at all in this deal. This alone suggests either an extraordinary level of delusion on the part of the Americans or else a proposal that is designed to be eminently rejectable. Even if Zelensky moved forward with it, the deal would not pass ratification by the Ukrainian government or legislature. So, what might the US be up to? And might Russia be guiding the process to an inevitable impasse? Well, here are a few ideas. If Zelensky accepts the deal, his own political position becomes precarious. If he accepts it and it's ratified, which of course is unlikely, it would block the path to EU accession of Ukraine. That also, as we've seen before, would cause deep political divisions. Maidan happened over exactly this issue. Given the likelier course that he rejects it, the US can paint Ukraine as an impediment to the peace process. And in fact, they would be able to paint Zelensky as an impediment as well. Rejection of the deal might also trigger internal political disputes in Ukraine, especially amongst ambitious political figures. And we can see hints of this already with Tymoshenko and Poroshenko, previous president and prime minister of Ukraine, involved in, dare I say it, plots, schemes, and machinations with representatives of the US. In fact, the division and confusion that would be triggered by either acceptance or rejection of the deal may well be the very purpose in crafting such an unfair and unpalatable proposal. The contract makes a few rhetorical nods to Ukraine, stating that the American people desire to invest alongside the Ukrainian people in a free, sovereign, and secure Ukraine, but there are no practical advantages attached to this wording. There are no concrete benefits about how that sort of empty phrase might be turned into a reality. It acknowledges Ukraine's contribution to peace by voluntarily abandoning the world's third largest arsenal of nuclear weapons in the Budapest Memorandum in 1994. But without security guarantees or further military aid, this clause in the document simply seems to rub Ukraine's face in the fact of historical betrayal and abandonment that this memorandum represents. This draft is harsher than the originals, and these were already deemed to be predatory and neo-colonial by international lawyers. European governments were aghast when the details were revealed. Trumpists will and have claimed that Putin would not dare attack if America had commercial skin in the game at this scale. But the historical examples, even from 2014 and 2022, demonstrate that this is a straw man argument. It simply does not hold water. As expected, voices in Moscow are delighted with the rumored terms of the agreement, both officials and propagandists. There is talk about Nord Stream. It would be interesting if the Americans put pressure on Europe to make them stop refusing our Russian gas, said Sergei Lavrov, Russia's foreign minister. Just as Ukrainians are expected to accept this process of being mugged for their resources, at the same time, Mr. Trump's chief negotiator, Steve Witkoff, was once more seen parroting Kremlin propaganda. He repeated the debunked lies about the sham referenda of Donetsk, Luhansk, Kherson, and Zaporizhia, and implied that Russia might have a case that, from its point of view, to claim those four oblasts as its own. Again, another reminder, Putin is not even close to conquering all of those territories. Trump has blown a winning hand, says Timothy Ash, a guest of this channel and an expert from Chatham House. Mr. Trump has agreed to help Russia restore its access to the world market for agriculture and fertilizer exports, lower maritime insurance costs, and enhance access to ports and payment systems for such transactions, as reward for the non-concession of a Black Sea maritime truce, which actually also helps Russia more than Ukraine. Ukraine has already kicked Russia's Black Sea fleet out of the Black Sea area and restored trade to near pre-wartime levels. This is the main feature of this deal. It gives America things that they have no innate right to. It demands things that are not in Zelensky's purview to give. And overall, the negotiation process is moving to grant Russia things they did not have, give them things they are desperate to have, but demands no real concessions from their side at all. Ukraine has shown itself to be brave and united in the face of unprecedented aggression by a nuclear power in the modern era. Now they are facing coercion and bullying by the US into accepting deals that would shatter that cohesion and mortgage the future of the Ukrainian economy. In this deal of two sticks and no carrot, Ukraine must reject this mafia extortion behavior from a former ally, but can only do this with confidence if Europe steps up to support Ukraine, not only with aid and military equipment, but also with more direct military involvement. If Ukraine capitulates to the US, and by extension Russia, it may eventually go down. And if Ukraine goes down, then we'll go down with it too.